Welcome to Nonprofit Impact on MeetAdvisors.com. I'm your host, Megan Dugan-Bassett of Dugan-Bassett Consulting. On Nonprofit Impact, we bring you dialogue about what works and what doesn't from leaders in philanthropy, public policy, and direct service organizations. Today, Laurel O'Sullivan has joined me. She has had a successful career as a public interest lawyer and advocate. She's worked at the National Resources Defense Council and the Alliance for the Great Lakes. More recently, at the Donors Forum, she led a multi-year initiative to engage their base of over 1,100 members more actively in public policy advocacy. And also, under her leadership there, funding for advocacy increased by over 300%. Following her work at the Donors Forum, Laurel started the Advocacy Collaborative to tap the power of advocacy to help more nonprofits meet their missions. It's such a pleasure to have you join us. Thank you, Laurel. I appreciate having you here.
Thanks, Megan. It's really great to be here.
So you have had a really successful career in public policy advocacy, but you are kind of embarking on a new approach. You're taking advocacy in new ways. It's a more non-traditional approach than what nonprofits usually do. What's the new approach that you're taking that's different from what nonprofits usually do in public policy advocacy?
So, Megan, that's a great question. We at the Advocacy Collaborative are passionate believers in the power of advocacy, not only to fulfill your mission, but also to better fund your mission and to achieve greater impact. And I think my experience in over 15 years of being an advocate and a capacity builder is that frequently in the nonprofit sector, we look at advocacy really narrowly. And so we want to look at advocacy expansively. And what I mean by that is, how does advocacy fulfill your functions across the organization? So what are the management functions when it comes to advocacy? What are the governance functions? What are the leadership functions? And what are the fundraising functions? So we really want to help nonprofits motivate them to be able to sustain their advocacy.
And for nonprofits that aren't familiar with what public policy advocacy is, can you say a little bit more about what you mean when you say advocacy?
Yes. So again, we look at advocacy on a spectrum. There's advocacy, there's public policy advocacy, and there's lobbying. And frequently we think of lobbying as being advocacy. Advocacy is really taking a public position to advance an issue or to advance an idea. That's how we look at it. And so it could be anything from public education and awareness building to actually targeting public officials and policymakers.
Right. Great. And so what is so powerful about advocacy? Why is this something that nonprofits should be trying, even if they're a direct service organization?
Well, because advocacy really has the ability to enhance everything that a nonprofit does. So for instance, it increases your visibility in the community by taking a position publicly. It attracts more funders and volunteers to your organization. And by looking at the larger system in which your nonprofit operates, you have the ability to really transform and bring a solution to bear that impacts more than potentially just your immediate stakeholders, but the larger community, whether it be local, regionally, or nationally.
Right. And I should also say that we are actually collaborating on this. Yes. So this is something I've worked a lot in advocacy, and this is something I love about public policy advocacy, is that instead of influencing a few people's lives, that if you find a policy that could help a lot of people or one that's harming people, you can actually have a huge, exponentially larger impact that really furthers your mission for many, many more people. So that's one of the things I really love about public policy advocacy and why I'm always trying to get more direct service nonprofits interested in taking this on in some way. So can you talk a little bit more about how the Advocacy Collaborative works?
Yes. So the Advocacy Collaborative is really a collaborative that brings together experts across the field. So for instance, you mentioned that we're working together and we have others in the fundraising, board development, evaluation and impact who can bring that deeper expertise. And so our goal is really to bring a wholesale set of advisors to a nonprofit as they tackle advocacy.
Okay, that's wonderful. So you've been doing a few case studies and looking at nonprofits that have done a particularly good job of engaging in public policy advocacy and have been really successful. So what are the commonalities across some of the organizations you've been looking at?
Well, there's a lot, and our goal with the case studies is really to kind of show the face of advocacy, because I think too often we have it in our heads in the nonprofit sector, oh, we can't do advocacy, we're too small. And in fact, that's really not the case. And so the two organizations very different. There's Thresholds, which is a well-respected mental health agency located in Chicago that has a $70 million budget. And then there's John Howard Association, which is a prison reform group, a watchdog that's been around for over 100 years, and that has done primarily research. But over the last 5 years, they have started to do more public policy advocacy. And as a result of that, John Mackey has been very successful in growing their budget, in doubling their budget from about $300,000 to $600,000. And so what I would say that these have in common, these organizations, is that they inherently understand that advocacy requires leadership. Their CEOs are willing to speak publicly about issues that may not be necessarily ones that at first glance they feel the public is necessarily going to understand. Mental health has a lot of stigma around it, as do prison populations. And so John Mackey decided to take on, for instance, Rahm Emanuel had a proposal to increase sentencing for first-time offenders. And over the course of 2 years, he's transformed that into a public debate that's now leading to talk of how do we really look at the overall prison system in Illinois. And both organizations were also able to take their policy work and align it with their program work. And what I mean by that is that they both have access to data. At Thresholds, they have the clinicians who work with their clients, and their policy expert, Heather O'Donnell, was able to take that to Springfield and to show the cost effectiveness of different approaches. And in John Mackey's case, they had lots of data around what it costs to actually house a prison inmate, and he's been able to use that effectively to influence the public conversation.
And so in both cases, they can use data that's aggregate, so it's not giving up anything for any clients. It's, you can keep it totally safe for clients, but still use what you're learning from this big group to inform advocacy.
Absolutely.
So what are some of the smart approaches? I know there's some common challenges that nonprofits, particularly direct service nonprofits, run into when they're trying to switch and to do some advocacy. Sometimes it can be a challenge fundraising and knowing where to go and knowing if funders are going to be open to it. But there's other challenges too. So what are some smart approaches you've seen?
Well, I think that there's so many. I think importantly is knowing how to be able to provide value to your stakeholders. I think that often nonprofits are criticized for not engaging those stakeholders enough in the work that they do. And so the most effective advocates that I've seen are the ones who have really thought about how do we establish that connection. And I would say that John Mackey has done a really good job of that, because he recognized that the stakeholders are wider than when just those who are related to individuals who are incarcerated. And so historically that was the way John Howard looked at it. And then over time, as he realized that there's a whole host of stakeholders, including the media, including others who have an interest in influencing policy. And so he reached out and developed a coalition. Similarly with Thresholds, they realized there was a whole, in addition to their clients, there were other stakeholders, other mental health advocates. And so they developed also a coalition and reached out to them. And you mentioned briefly on the fundraising side, I would say those organizations who do online fundraising, Blackbaud did some research in 2011 to show that organizations engaged in advocacy who also have an online presence are far more successful in fundraising, because individuals, and especially the 20 to 30 something generation, they're looking for something to get involved with, to get engaged with. And so a lot of the most creative nonprofits recognize that connection between advocacy and fundraising.
And so when you say an online presence, you mean from an advocacy perspective, so engaging people in responding to their legislators and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so e-activism, encouraging them to write newsletters or to write emails in response to a newsletter that they've sent out, and then being able to track those individuals and ask for a donation has proven to be very effective.
Okay, that's great. So one of the things you talk about, and maybe you've already covered this enough, so it's fine if you feel like you don't have a lot more you want to cover on this, but you've talked about an advocacy forward organization. Can you tell us more about what that is, and what are some of the first steps that nonprofits can take to become an advocacy forward organization?
I think the first step and the most important step, and often the overlooked step, is really making sure that across the organization there's a shared understanding of what it means for that organization to be engaged in advocacy. And too often I've seen organizations who jump right ahead to the tactics. I think that's in the nonprofit sector, we just want to do when it comes to advocacy. We want to jump ahead and do the tactics, and what we often find is that we're then not well positioned or able to sustain that work, or we're only able to be reactive. So advocacy forward organizations get out ahead of that, and they say, we're going to engage our board, we're going to engage our leadership team, and we're going to sit down and have a conversation about what it is that we're trying to accomplish with advocacy and what we believe is our unique value add.
Right. Well, that's wonderful. Thank you. I really appreciate all the things you've shared with us today. It's really great.
Thanks, Megan. It's been great being here.
Thank you, and look for more inspiring nonprofit leaders on meetadvisors.com.